The Doomed Voyage of St. Carella, a story by T.A. Gomez in the Tales of Tydale series. Chapter 1. Don't rob any Statarians and sure as hell don't kill any. Don't enslave or ransom anyone if you can understand their language. I mean it. Dado checked, held his hand over the letter of marque, awaiting a confirmation. A ruby ring with a gem the size of a rat's eye squeezed his fat middle finger like a boa. 4 years ago, Checht would have laughed at the suggestion he'd ever own jewelry, let alone be too fat for it. Now he was accustomed to wealth, though less so his weight, as he still bought clothes fit for a man a few inches smaller around the waist. You're understood, sire. I'll brief the crew before setting sail and each time we spot a vessel to be sure it sticks. The woman, hardly tall enough to stand at eye level with the Baron sitting, looked woefully out of place in the extravagant office of the wealthiest man in eastern Aost. Her poet blouse was riddled with holes. The ones risking immodesty were covered with a vest made of wolfskin that stopped below her breasts. Her breeches were creased and worn through, rolled up to just below her knees, exposing bruises and scars that told stories of years at sea. She dropped a bag of 50 pennies into the Baron's free hand. Like a key in a lock, the coins in one palm lifted the other, and she was able to take the letter. That simple document was all she needed for legitimacy. A letter of marque designated a pirate a privateer. She would no longer be Engracia Omal, pirate of the Caseir Sea, but Lady Omal of the Aostian contracted naval fleet. Such a position required remarkably little in matters of conduct or duty, while offering all the benefits that came with recognition by the state. Open trade with friendly markets, free travel through domestic waters and seas controlled by non-warring powers, and no pesky bounties to return to when she docked back home. A 10% cut for Baron Checht and dues owed to her crew, and she would still earn more in a month than she would sailing 5 years as a merchant captain. With no small amount of difficulty, Dado rose from his seat and moseyed around his resin-varnished ebony desk, past the silver-barred bay window that looked out to the ports where sailors were hauling crates of goods from their ships onto carts bound for the city. Their shouts were muffled by the ringing of bells and squawking gulls, each crew filling orders and calling back to their shipmates what to withdraw from their inventories. Most of Dado's business these days revolved around managing these busy docks. It was a laborious but lucrative task. Before the king's death, he was a simple accountant for Horizon Shipping, one of Aosti's up-and-coming shipping companies. But when Prince Nicholas took over the throne, one of his first decrees was the clearing of acres to expand the country's export industry, effectively providing traders with foreign goods in exchange for Aostian lumber and silver. The expansion of trade required an overseer and, with a few strategically placed bits of silver, Dado Checht was suddenly in charge of thousands of men and immeasurable sums of wealth, with an unspoken agreement that Horizon Shipping would enjoy a great deal of it. The Baron gestured towards the map on his southern wall. Anything north of this line, Dado's pudgy fingers pointed about 100 kilometers south of Statiria's shores, is strictly off limits. Now, if you should see any Eastian ships, the non-engagement rule only applies if within the agreed area. Similar rules apply to Shalene and Sapertian vessels. If you catch them in Kiakaro waters, well, engage at your own discretion. He shifted and gestured southeast of the poorly mapped southern continent. Your main source of income will be right here. This is Gartro land, and you'll find they're far less formidable than their neighbors. You're of course welcome to engage with Hopuri vessels on the west coast, but you've been warned. A Hopuri crew of 3 will wipe half your shipmates out before you're within 100 yards. These aren't pampered traders like you're used to here. The Baron stopped and raised an eyebrow at the woman, allegedly. All hearsay and gossip, of course. Engracia bowed her head. One of the terms of her contract was complete denial of any prior criminal wrongdoing. She was never a pirate as far as Aoste cared to know. Remember, Miss Omal, these are the people who fought back a Statarian invasion. At least bring some pennies home before getting yourself killed. Dado sat back down with a low growl, his chair squealing for mercy beneath him. Now, if that's all... It's not, Engracia said. Be honest with me, sire. Why are we just making this arrangement now? What difference does that make? You've been handed amnesty and a contract to go about your business elsewhere. Don't ruin a good thing for yourself. Well, now that I'm officially a captain in the King's Navy, perhaps it's best I know what the motivation is for my commanding officers. Letters of marque were a Statarian myth 10 years ago, but the Crown never touched the idea for as long as I've been a Engracia stopped herself. Sailor. Everything but the Queen's ass is for sale in Aosta, but never a privateer contract? Why? It's business, Lady Omal. Nothing more, nothing less. In case you've forgotten, King Nicholas is in charge now, and he was smart enough to realize that it was better to hire your kind to bring back goods from the East than it is to place bounties and waste soldiers chasing you into the void. Engracia folded her arms and leaned against the wall. The gulls outside were in a frenzy over a fishing boat newly docked in the harbor. You're lying to me. There's more to it than that. I'm a baron, and before that I was an accountant for a Caseir merchant company. If you're expecting me to say anything more than what I need you to know, then, pardon the expression, but you're fingering the wrong cunt. Engracia adjusted her cuffs and stood upright. If Dado wouldn't shed light on the Crown's change of heart, her first mate would. Melina undoubtedly had thoughts on the Baron's motives. She had thoughts on all things pertaining to the anxieties and ambitions of authority. Can't say I'm familiar with that one, she said. That's not what I've heard. Dado gave her a look that let her know he had nothing more to say on the matter. Fine, it makes no difference to me. We'll sail over the Caseir and be back in a few months with your dues. She was a few steps from the doorway when Dado stopped her. Before you leave, Engracia turned to see Dado now parsing through an open book on his desk. The Baron's eyes didn't leave the pages. Around 2 years ago, a galleon went missing about 4 miles off the shores of western Stataria. Aboard was Lord Var Rosnucia Deventus of Maroltis. Yes, I've heard the stories. An amused smirk crawled up Engracia's lips. Of course you have, Dado replied. He held the silence for Engracia to fill, expecting her to say more. It was a simple trick, the sort of thing amateur guardsmen did to squeeze confessions out of petty thieves. She almost felt offended by the attempt. Dado turned his attention away from his book to look at her, somehow reading her reaction and pretending to be equally offended that she suspected him of something so beneath him. This isn't an interrogation, Engracia, he said at last. Do you think so little of me that I'd bring you here on suspicion that your little vessel contributed to the disappearance of a ship nearly 10 times the size of your own? I don't know what you expect me to say. I know no more than anyone else, only that it's something of a folk legend by now. The ship goes down, bits wash ashore over the course of a few weeks, and no one knows what caused it. There's a lot of things that can bring a ship down. Storms, hopuri, stranded on a high seabed if the captain isn't paying attention, or even if she is. Sailing is a dangerous business, my lord. And what leaves charred boards behind? What disappears one of the most powerful men in Stataria? I assumed most of those details were the story getting away from itself. Why do you care, Dado? This sounds like Stataria's problem. It is, Dado agreed, closing his book. But dangerous waters are bad for business. Engracia faked a laugh. A ship capsized 2 years ago and now you're worried how it will affect your business? I'm beginning to think you lie more for pleasure than deceit because you're not putting in much of an effort. What is it, Dado? What are you actually asking me? Fine. There's no way to ask this question without appearing like a fool, so perhaps we'd best get it over with. Do you have any reason to believe phenomena from the void are presenting themselves in our waters? Engracia laughed again, this time with total sincerity. You think Deventus was what, eaten by a sea monster? Dado didn't reply. It was a different silence now, the quiet agony of ignorance tormenting a man unaccustomed to not knowing. This time, Engracia did fill it. Lord Kecht, I have done no sailing in the void. I value my life too much for that. But if magical storms, leviathan beasts, and howling specters were in the Caseir, then I wouldn't be alive to tell you. The sea is as it's always been, as surely as I am a legitimate captain honored to serve her motherland. Dado observed her for a long while, nodded, and closed his book. That will do, Lady Engracia. Chapter 2. Travelers, merchants, and fishermen hurried busily along the maze of terracotta buildings and moldy wooden shop fronts that overlooked the pier. The more knowledgeable pedestrians kept their purses close or tucked into the crotch of their breeches, to avoid the wandering hands of street urchins and rambunctious beggars roaming the walkways. Less informed tourists gazed starry-eyed at the vast quantity of goods circulating wildly in every direction, so ensnared by the energy of the doubly marketplace that only when they reached for their coppers to sample some of the wares did they realize their money and more valuable possessions were long gone. A man in an olive tunic and a black wool flat cap speckled with dirt was standing atop a wood crate. His face was weathered and sunken with age, but he shouted with all the vibrancy and enthusiasm of a young man, loud enough to be heard over the constant clamoring of the city. The late King Maltese was a just man, a fine ruler, a capable leader, all the more why the true circumstances of his death are so heinous. His assassin goes unpunished. They lie and say a man of his health should die at as young an age as 60. I implore you, people of this land, open your eyes to the truth. Regicide has befallen us all, and we cannot rest, if not for justice, if not for honor, then for the safety of his son and our new liege, the High King Nicholas. What treachery awaits him in a nest of vipers? Maltese falls fatally ill with no prior reports of ailment? No malaise or fatigue. After all, we would see the man regularly, listen to him speak from the balcony of the palace, gracing us with his wisdom. No, such a man was not fated for a natural death so young. The only answer is murder, vile murder, and why hide it if not out of complicity? There is no incompetence in the king's guard, my countrymen. The royal practitioners of medicine, alchemy, and magic, the advisors, the ministers, and the spies of the palace, none are free from suspicion. A traitor hides among them. A traitor, I say, waiting to strike like a serpent in tall grass. "Oi, shut your mouth, you damn nut!" a voice yelled. A shirtless fisherman, heavily tattooed and muscled with a head thick enough to crush bricks, broke from the crowd. He stared at the crier with crossed arms and a scowl. A king is a king is a king. He probably died from boredom. What in the hell did the man even do all day? Too scared to piss off the merchants and risk a port shutdown, won't challenge the mercenary guilds and face a coup. He wouldn't even acknowledge the druids crying to him about deforestation south of Drow Enis, his supposed ancestral homeland. His son'll be the same. Austey's not had a leader who's acted of his own volition in God's knows how long. Don't know why we even got a damn king anymore. No use for 'em. They're like a hunting hound with no chompers. Things'll carry on the same, and there's no reason to hop up on a shoeshiner's box and drag the guards down here with all this talk of conspiracy. What say you, miss? Ingracia stopped, barely registering that she'd been spoken to. Usually she ignored anyone who accosted her on the street when she was in the city, but instead of carrying on, she felt compelled to reply. I've not caught much of what you said, but if you've had enough of kings and spies, I'd suggest taking to the sea while you still can. Last bloody scrap of freedom left on this earth. The fisherman laughed and nodded his head. Too right, miss, too right. Now, with a smile, he made his way to the docks to return to work. The crier continued his proselytizing, once again becoming an ambient drone humming over Dudley's cacophony. Beneath the noise, there played out a more quiet encounter. Behind the conspiracist, a line of derelict storefronts shouted over him, each offering their own bargains and artisan wares to anyone who should happen by. One booth, the most derelict of them all, seemingly constructed in a haste that very morning, had lured in a handful of tourists with an old Aostian attraction, the Fortune Pyramid. It was a turning music box sort of contraption in the fashion of a tapered sphere. 4 players place a bet, each receiving a card to symbolize their position. Despite the name, the good fortune awarded to the winner was less relevant than the prize of the other players' bets, minus the 5% allotted to the dealer. 4 players were lined up as the dealer explained the rules. He was a clean-shaven man in an oversized patch leather jerkin, with a smile working overtime to compensate for his off-putting beady eyes. You've got your bets laid down, 3 pennies apiece, see? He hovered his hand over each bet without touching the coins. I've taken a half-penny from each. The cost of the game, of course, but the rest is all yours to win, see? You each get one of these. The dealer stuck his hand out, delivering 4 cards face down to the patron on his left. A young man whose graying long beard and frizzled hair ill-suited his childlike face. You've all picked your cards. Now one of you will place the cards face up in whichever order you please. That way you don't think I'm choosing whose card goes where, see? The patron did as instructed, laying the cards down in 4 separate casket-shaped crevices before a small circular opening at the mouth of the pyramid. "Well done, sir!" The dealer beamed with an uncalled-for enthusiasm. "Yours truly cranks the handle, see? A compartment within the top opens, and the marble falls into a carousel that continues until he releases. Now, you all have chosen your cards. For our shuffler, the firebomb. Fitting for a youthful, handsome soul such as yourself, sir. The delightful, gentle beauty has, in an act befitting her enchanting, heart-lightening presence, picked the jester, a fine choice. Her dashing companion, the temple. And finally, the warrior for our Statirian guest." "Oh, he's not from Stateria, but we are," the woman said. She was none as beautiful as the dealer claimed. Still, she stood out like a marble brick in a mud hut, dressed in a sapphire silk gown with elaborate frills and her hair pinned high above her head in a band aligned with pearls. Unfortunately for her, Statarian upper-class notions of beauty did not translate well in Aoste, and the only heads she managed to turn were those of thieves whose mouths were watering at the thought of snatching the pearls from her crown. Her companion was equally well-dressed, adorned in a woven crimson doublet with pristine white hose. He was thin around the waist with a long, pointed mustache. "Indeed," he chuckled, the ends of his whiskers vibrating with his voice. "The man you identified as Statarian is our bodyguard, while I oversee some financial affairs here, a few signatures and meetings to cap off some import business. It is better to hire someone who knows the land than someone from back home who only knows fighting off Nordlings. This is the first time I've seen the city myself, and I'm quite glad a courier service would not have sufficed for my needs. It lives up to, no, exceeds, the second-hand chatter of my colleagues, enterprising to its very atom, every man a salesman, every home a burgeoning frontier of mercantile innovation. My restraint is tested each time I step out the door, tempted by another offer to spend over my allotted budget for our trip." The dealer smiled brightly and feigned flattery. "You are too kind, sir. Too kind, see? We are all too grateful to have you and your business in our land. Forgive my mistake. Statirians, of course. In such marvelous attire, you could only be from that land of bounty, but my eye tells me you are the cream of the crop, as they say." He received only an enthused chuckle in reply. Statirian upperclassmen were a growing sight in Dublin, hence why thieves were flocking to its ports like they were on pilgrimage. The dealer knew as much, but, in his experience, it was more disarming to play a fool when dealing with visitors from that part of the world. He continued explaining the game as the 4 leaned in close. Between his index finger and thumb, he held a marble, polished and black as obsidian. "We'll place 3 of these in the top. The black ball, a metaphorical symbol of your demise, see? If you receive this marble, you are excluded from the game and forfeit your pile. The dead have no use for money. Now this." He drew a 4th marble, bright as spun gold, from below the counter and held it for them to view before realizing by the ball's contrast that his nails were filthy. Sincerely embarrassed, he withdrew the shimmering ball in his palm. "This here," he held the gold marble by his chest, laying his hand flat instead, "marks the lucky winner. If this little trinket lands on your card, you take the haul, unless it lands before everyone else receives a black marble. If it does, then the receiver of the marble chooses whether to split the pot among those without the black marble or let the game ride for a chance to win it all. Sir, since you've placed bets on behalf of your 2 companions, I'd advise you to let it ride in such a scenario, but of course, the choice remains yours, see?" "See we shall." The nobleman smiled, brushing the end of his bristles with his fingertips. "First, we place the lucky marble into the top." The dealer dropped the marble through an opening at the peak of the pyramid and began churning its handle. The ball spilled into the upper corridor of the device's innards and spun along a carousel decorated with cayenne-painted parchment. With each turn, the paper breathed, depicting the rise and fall of waves as painted ships on the device's exterior sailed along them. And the mark of death? He poured in the 3 black marbles until all of the balls appeared to be spinning through the same corridors. In truth, they were in entirely different chambers. Fortune pyramids were as plentiful as splinters in Aostian port towns. The rules sometimes changed, but the odds didn't. In reality, the game was invented as a means to trick drunks and ignorant visitors out of their money. The scam played out with the golden marble being placed first, unbeknownst to the marks, in a sort of decoy chamber designed to close after the marble is deposited. Reflective glass gives the illusion that the marble is spinning along the same corridors as the black ones, but in fact, the black marbles are dropped into a second chamber, the only chamber with a chance of releasing onto the cards. Simple devices were designed to reroute the chambers by the fourth release, always giving the final player the golden marble and thus a victory. More fanciful ones had switch releases, so the hustler could choose the victor on whatever turn he wished. Regardless of the turn, the winner would always be the scammer's accomplice. Any intricacies or aesthetic changes to the device more or less functioned to distract the players from realizing they were being taken for a ride. The first marble fell, rattling down the pyramid's chute and bouncing around the sarcophagus of the jester card. "Sorry, miss, you're out. Death comes for us all, but it came for you a bit earlier than most." "Oh, blast it!" exaggerated the woman. Her smile returned quickly as she clung onto her partner's arm. "I'm afraid I've lowered your odds, dear," she giggled. The wealthy Statarian gave her arm a reassuring pat and offered a quizzical squint to the dealer. "I find the use of the word death as a disqualification a tad morbid, sir." The dealer continued to crank the handle, gazing up at him from beneath his brow. "Do you now?" "Yes, I suppose it would. The cultural difference has escaped me again, my friend. I mean, no offense, see? Death is not seen as something so final and bleak here. It is as definitive as the completion of a single chapter in an endless storybook." That is astute and not incompatible with eternalism, but the subject of death is still a grisly one and best reserved for solemn affairs and reflection through grief. We are eternalists, and while we are comforted by existing alongside him someday in his kingdom, our lives are a gift to be cherished. Am I to understand our missionaries have been so unsuccessful as to never reach your ears with their gospel? They have come, sir, yet faith is plentiful here. The dealer wiped his brow with the wrist of his free hand, the other still churning the marbles through the carousel. The question of death has 1,000 answers in these cities. Who am I to say which is correct? I have come to understand that there will be a day when the sea boils and the stars fall like rain from the sky. Then, it begins again. In the craters from salt and coral and rusted iron, another world shall begin anew, unbound by our limits of understanding, not pigeonholed by the innovations and conventions of our times, not even these frail bodies and minds. Perhaps if we are lucky, we will bear witness through an untarnished perception, free of the pitiable condition of the self. He stopped, and the sound of the marbles rolling within the pyramid churned until another black one fell onto the temple card. "Afraid you're out, sir. 2 remain." The man, now unconcerned with the game, and, like any avowed eternalist, gracious to seize an opportunity to proselytize, pushed the subject further. "It is inscribed in every man's heart what faith is true. Eternalism will find you as it finds us all, I assure you. But then the choice of salvation will be yours to make, for our God values loyalty. Can yours offer you anything so worthwhile as paradise for your eternal soul?" The dealer paused and smirked. His mask fell, very briefly, and the facade through which he carried out his spectacle lifted enough for an honest answer to emerge from beneath. "I serve whichever God serves me, as every Aostian does. I am a stalwart disciple of the Temple of Fairbairn, the same as our High King to the tax collector, a druid when I speak to my traditionalist mother from the countryside, and whichever faith the woman I most fancy at the time prefers me to be. If the future demands I be an eternalist, then so shall I be." "You cannot simply claim to be an eternalist?" the Statarian scoffed, evidently not pleased by the dealer's openness to conversion. "Do you think the God of all gods wouldn't notice insincerity?" "Why should he care? Do you think I'd be the only one?" The dealer returned to spinning the carousel and retreated back into his persona. The couple's bodyguard spoke for the first time. "As every Aostian does, he says. You'll not save a soul where there's none to be found, sir." He spat in the mud. "He's a cockroach, the sort who would say whatever suits him with no concern for blaspheming or dishonor. so long as he can scurry away only to abandon any proclaimed principles the moment it no longer serves him. The dealer did not react to the insult. He ceased churning the pyramid and a black marble fell onto the warrior card. Would I be wrong to assume you hired this Aostian because he claimed to be an adamant believer in your god? I'm afraid you've lost. The bodyguard leaned in close, his hand wrapped around the hilt of his sword so tightly that his knuckles paled. And I suppose that lad who is quickly pocketing our bets, the fellow who shuffled the cards on your behalf, is your accomplice? The dealer's eyes darted back to the couple, then locked on their bodyguard. It's a game, sir, he said slowly. I'm sorry, but you've lost. Don't embarrass us in front of our country's guests. Ah, the guard flashed an ugly smile. I'm embarrassing us? Not you two charlatans? Prove me wrong, then. One more spin. I'll place the marbles myself with another draw. He roughly grabbed at the deck tucked within the dealer's shirt pocket, pulled from it a single card, and sent several more spilling to the floor as he pulled away. The vulture! He feigned amusement and pretended to admire the simplistic depiction of a scavenger bird pecking through the shell of a washed-up tortoise carcass. Looks familiar, doesn't it? Excuse me, the Statarian nobleman spoke up. Am I being led to believe you are pulling some sort of scam on us? If that is the case, simply return our money before we alert a guardsman. Your bodyguard is lying, muttered the man accused of being the dealer's accomplice. I won this lot fair and square. It's nothing more than a shakedown from this common thug you've employed. Not a peep from him until he lost. Funny that. I'm not returning any money that I've won fair and square. Fair and square, you scoundrel? The swordsman hissed. You've got a lot of nerve. Oh, it's only some pennies, dear. The woman clung to her partner's shirt anxiously. I think we should leave before this all goes any further. Hardly, he shouted, his face growing red. I come to this country with my business and am taken advantage of by some petty cultist and his compatriot, treated like a fool by some rabble scum. We'll alert one of the guardsmen and give this country a chance to redeem itself. You'll get no redemption from the authorities here, sneered the bodyguard. These rats will scamper away before they can catch up to them. Then the guard'll take the whole lot as evidence, and you'll never see your money again. The only solution is to give them a good hiding to keep them licking their wounds for a few months before they start robbing good folks like you again. The bodyguard lunged to grab the pennies from the coin purse, now stuffed with the game's pool. The woman screamed as the accomplice jumped back, shoving her aside. The nobleman went for his sword. In a fervor, the dealer grabbed the fortune pyramid and jumped away from the unfolding chaos. The bodyguard lurched forward with one arm extended to grab the pouch, while the other pulled his sword from its hilt. Through bulging eyes, the dealer's accomplice stuck out the rest of his body while holding the purse far above his head, as though its safety were more important than his own. Several people turned to see the source of the commotion. Two men with their swords drawn, a fortune pyramid dealer running from his stand with his device tucked beneath his arm, and a Statarian noblewoman cursing and shouting in the mud. There was a brief, aching silence as everyone considered what to do next. The standoff was diffused at once when, with a loud cry, a low-flying gull swooped from above in a swift arc, parted its beak, and snatched the coin purse from the hustler's elevated hand. Before anyone could react, the entire haul was in its jaws, soaring with the bird back into the air and disappearing into the flock hanging above the port. By eternal, muttered the Statarian man. His partner, now filthy and thoroughly upset, huffed from below. He recouped himself enough to tend to her, but remained unable to pull his eyes from the sky. The bodyguard spit and sheathed his sword. Serves you right, you fucking hoodlum. You'll get nothing now. Get out of our sight before my employer cuts your hands off for laying a finger on the lady. Without a word, the accomplice, now white as marble, turned his back and ran, pushing his way through the crowd and disappearing into the city. Whispers were spreading about guardsmen on the approach, and Ingracia, until then indulging the spectacle, instinctively took off. She let herself enjoy doubly for longer than she'd intended, and now made a beeline for her boat. Later that day, when the guard never arrived, the Statarian couple would be found floating in the harbor, their bodyguard counting pearls with his legs dangling over the pier. Far above him, on the balcony of a tall terracotta building overlooking the sea, The fortune pyramid dealer and his accomplice would crack open a bounty of fresh crayfish purchased moments prior, the game's winner holding up the shells for the gull perched on his shoulder to pick at for bits of meat.